George Washington was a Virginia plantation owner who served as a general and commander-in-chief of the colonial armies during the American Revolutionary War, and later became the first president of the United States, serving from 1789 to 1797. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was the eldest of Augustine and Mary's 6 children, all of whom survived into adulthood.
The family lived on Pope Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. They were moderately prosperous members of Virginia middle class.
In 1735, his father, Augustine, moved the family up the Potomac River to another Washington family home, later Hunting Creek Plantation, later renamed to Mount Vernon.
It is known that from age 7 to 15, Washington was homeschooled and studied with the local church sextons, and later a schoolmaster in practical maths, geography, Latin, and the English classic.
But much of the knowledge he would use the rest of his life was through his acquaintance with woodmen and the plantation foremen. By his early teens, he had mastered growing tobacco, stock raising, and surveying. He was homeschooled until he was 16. When he left home, he became a surveyor. A surveyor is someone who maps and inspects land. Washington traveled with a surveying party plotting land in Virginia's Western Territory. The following year, aided by Lord Fairfax, Washington received an appointment as the official surveyor of Culpeper County. Washington's father died when he was 11, and he became the ward of his half-brother Rollins, who gave him a good upbringing. Rollins had inherited the family's Little Hunting Creek plantation and married Anne Fairfax, the daughter of Colonel William Fairfax. Under her tutelage, Washington was schooled in the finer aspects of colonial culture. In July 1752, Washington's brother Rollins died, making him the heir apparent of Washington lands. Rollins' only child, Sarah, died 2 months later, and Washington became the head of one of Virginia's most prominent estates, Mount Vernon, when he was 20 years old. His pre-revolutionary military career began in French and Indian War. On October 1753, Dinwiddie sent Washington to Fort Le Boeuf at what is now Waterford, Pennsylvania, to warn the French to remove themselves from land claimed by Britain. The French politely refused, and Washington made a hasty ride back to Williamsburg.
During the encounter, Washington escaped injury with 4 bullet holes in his cloak and 2 horses shot out from under him. Though he fought bravely, he could do a little to turn back to the rout and lead the defeated army back to safety.
Though a little embarrassed at being captured, he was grateful to receive the thanks from the House of Burgesses and see his name mentioned in the London Gazette. Washington was given the honorary rank from colonel and joined British General Edward Braddock's army in Virginia. The British had devised a plan for a 3-pronged assault on French forces attacked in Fort Doukhart, Fort Niagara, and Crown Point.
After losing Philadelphia in December 1777, Washington and his army had to find a place to seek refuge from the harsh winter that was coming. Valley Forge was an answer for Washington because it was in the middle of the jungle, which is far from the British army. It means that they did not have to be concerned about a surprise attack from the British army. During their journey from Pennsylvania to Valley Forge, many soldiers had disappeared as they were not able to handle the British weather with tons of snow that continued biting them. Finally, on 19 December 1777, they had arrived at Valley Forge with their soulless body after having been through a cruel journey. They hurriedly built shelters from the cold night with the starvation and fatigue that they were carrying. At Valley Forge, there was a scarcity of food and clothes. What the soldiers had to eat were black pepper soup and fire cakes made of water and flour. Worse than that, they had faced many diseases that came with coldness and unhygienic living conditions, such as smallpox, dysentery, pneumonia, and typhus. Finally, they were saved in time by the Continental Congress after they had been requested many times for clothes, food, and medicine. However, this winter had killed around 2,000 of them. According to this incident, Washington was questioned whether he should be degraded or not. After France and many other countries became allied with America, they decided to help America fight with Britain in order to get their independence. When the assistance of France had arrived in America, one of them was an ex-Prussian soldier named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, who came to help training and reorganizing the Continental Army to be competent and ready for the upcoming battle, which would greatly help the American army later, particularly in the Battle of Yorktown.
Battle of Yorktown. After the Revolutionary War has been fought for a long time, finally, the battle was fought at Yorktown, Virginia between September 28 and October 19, 1781 for 22 days. General at Battle of Yorktown. General Washington commanded the American Army. Lieutenant General de Rochambeau commanded the French troops. Major General Lord Cornwallis commanded the British Army. As a result, Lord Cornwallis, a British general, surrenders 8,000 British troops and seamen to Franco-American forces, which finally led to the end of American Revolution. Before the battle, in the fall of 1781, the British occupied Yorktown. Cornwallis was planning to refit and resupply his 9,000-man forces, while he waits for the Royal Navies to provide supplies and much-needed reinforcement. The Continental Army seized an opportunity. Washington and Rochambeau moved their force of almost 8,000 men south to Virginia, planning to join lead about 12,000 other military French troops and Continental troops in the siege of Yorktown. On September 5, while the Allied army was still en route, the French fleet guarded the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. The Royal Navy, attempting to sail up to the Belle to Cornwallis, is met by French warships at the mouth of the Chesapeake. In this encounter, called the Battle of Chesapeake Capes, the British fleet is soundly defeated and forced to abandon Cornwallis' army at Yorktown. On the September 14th, Washington arrived at Williamsburg, Virginia with his army, and there he studied the British positions in Yorktown nearby.
On September 28, American and French forces marched out from Williamsburg and moved position to surround Yorktown. Washington and his soldiers marched position to into the right side, while Rochambeau and his soldiers are on the left side. On October 6, troops moved out in rainy night to dig the first parallel. Beginning of the bombardment at Yorktown on October 9, all of the French and American guns were in the position along the line. General Washington firing the first shot. October 11th, General Washington ordered work to begin on the second parallel, which brought the Americans within several hundred yards of the British line. The second parallel could not be completed until the Americans took British redoubts 9 and 10, part of the British defense line. October 14th, American and French forces seized redoubts 9 and 10, two small earthen forts, which anchored the eastern portion of the British defense lines. October 16, before dawn, British attempted an ill-fated counterattack to stop the American advance. Lord Cornwallis knew his options were limited.
In the late evening, Lord Cornwallis attempted to ferry his troops from Yorktown to Gloucester Point on the north side of the river. The British hoped to break out and flee north while abandoning their sick and wounded soldiers. A bad storm during the night stopped the transfer of British troops from Yorktown to Gloucester Point.
October 17th, a British drummer and officer waving a white flag marked British fortifications. They sought a truce to discuss surrender terms. On the same day, a British fleet left New York to relieve Lord Cornwallis. At 2 p.m. on October 19, the British marched from the remains of Yorktown. They stacked their weapons and surrendered the flag.
In summary, firstly, in the battle, General George Washington was commander-in-chief of the American side. The British side had Lieutenant General Lord Cornwallis as their commander. The Battle of Yorktown is known by many names. The Battle of Yorktown or the Siege of Yorktown. Next, the end of battle. Commander-in-chief of the British Army was besieged by American and French navies and armies. British General Lord Cornwallis and his army surrendered to General George Washington's American force and its French allies at the Battle of Yorktown on 19 October 1781. Finally, the outcome in Yorktown was the last major of the Battle of American Revolutions and the start of new nation's independence. It also cemented Washington's reputation as a great leader and eventual elections as first President of the United States.
Next, how did George Washington become the first president of the United States? In the Revolutionary War, George Washington was honored as a king, but he refused it. Instead, he said that Americans should have a constitution with the president as the supreme leader as a democracy. He decided to create the position of the president as opposed to possibly a new monarch. So, how the election worked? The way to elect it: first, the people vote for an elector to vote for the president instead of voting for the presidential candidate directly. Second, in the most states, whoever wins over half of the state vote automatically get all of the state electoral college vote. However, because Washington was so popular for his great leadership, in 1787, Washington was elected as a president of the Constitution Convention, and he used his influence to persuade the state to ratify the result constitution. Later in 1789, Washington was elected as the first president of the United States. This was the huge change for America, to bring the individual states together and create a government. Moreover, he also had two closest advisors, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, as the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Moreover, George Washington served two 4-year terms, establishing a strong and stable nation. However, he wanted to retire in the first term, but because of he was so popular, and he was re-elected for a second term in 1792. After he retired in 1797, he died at Mount Vernon on December 14, 1799.
Thank you for watching, and next are the questions for you to answer.